Let's talk about the terminology. The PCI DSS have some terms that may seem intimidating to people that are not familiar with them, such as the CDE or card data environment, CHD or cardholder data, which also can include SAD, which is sensitive authentication data, and there are even more terms about the payment industry in general. So before we proceed, let's take this lesson just to review the common terminology used in the PCI DSS. Before proceeding with clarifying the PCI DSS framework, it's important to clarify certain abbreviations and terms that show up over and over again. And these can be related to data, to networks, systems, and other elements. First, I want to clarify two terms, which are the CDE and CHD. So the CDE, or card data environment, is nothing more than the set of networks and systems where cardholder data, or CHD, is stored or transmitted, as opposed to the rest of your systems and networks, which are the non-CDE, or non-card data environment. Let's put it in very simple terms. You're a coffee shop and you have two Wi-Fi networks. Only one of these is used for payments, so that one is in the card data environment. The other one is used for guests, for example. That one is not in the card data environment. But the moment that card data is stored or transmitted in this other Wi-Fi, it immediately becomes part of the card data environment. And by that same token, your point of sale, the database where you store the card data, or any paper records where you store or transmit card data are all in the CDE. Actually, one of the practices before starting a PCI DSS assessment is something called scoping. And scoping is precisely determining the scope of the card data environment. So if you have 500 machines, 36 Wi-Fi networks, which of these store or transmit card data and which don't? And taking it one step further, after scoping, organizations usually try and reduce the scope of the card data environment. Because remember, only that card data environment needs to comply with the PCI DSS. In the same example, if one Wi-Fi is used for card data and the other one is used for guests, then obviously the one for guests does not need to comply with the PCI DSS. So in short, the card data environment is any system or network where your card data stay or even pass through. That's the simple definition. And then we have the CHD, or cardholder data itself. As you're probably guessing, these are the data on credit cards or debit cards. As we'll see in a minute, this is not all credit card data, only the one usually on the front. So account numbers, expiration dates, and others. Usually, the sensitive data, so the PIN, the CVV code, and others that would allow an authorization by themselves are in a special category, which we'll see in a minute. And as you're probably guessing, this cardholder data must be secured both in storage and in transit. The presence of cardholder data in a system or a network is precisely what makes it part of the card data environment. In terms of cardholder data, we can even go deeper and clarify what is the type of cardholder data that can be stored. What I mean by this is the following. There are usually two categories of data in a credit or debit card. Usually the data on the front and the data on the back. The data on the front can usually be stored and transmitted. It's the CHD, while the data on the back can only be transmitted but never stored. That's the SAD, or sensitive authentication data. So first, we have CHD, and CHD are usually the data on the front of the card. So it includes, for example, the full card number, which has an acronym by itself, which is the PAN, or personal account number. It's the full number on the card. Usually, you may see it masked when in transit. For example, the first 6 digits can be shown as well as the last four. Everything in the middle is the unique part related to your account. Besides the personal account number, we usually have the expiration date and any other data that may be on the front. So the cardholder name, the tier of the card, personal branding or identification, and more. And then, as mentioned, the SAD or sensitive authentication data is usually the data on the back of the card. So these are the data that would allow a transaction to be performed by themselves. And that's why they cannot be stored at all under PCI DSS. Think of it this way. If a hacker steals the full account number, the full card number, that's bad. But if they steal the full card number and the CVV code, that would be devastating for a company. So the SAD cannot be stored at all. It usually includes, first, the 3-digit card security number, which depending on the brand may be called the CVV number, the CVV2 number, the CVC number, or others. Then, the magnetic track itself, or the PIN number of the card. So again, the biggest distinction is that cardholder data can be stored and transmitted. Sensitive authentication data can be transmitted but never stored. Otherwise, it's an immediate failure of compliance with PCI DSS. Then, the PCI DSS set of standards by themselves include 6 major goals and 12 requirements. Each of the goals of the framework is usually associated with one or more requirements. There's a one-to-many relationship, if you will. For example, as of version 3.2.1, one of the goals is to build and maintain a secure network, and it contains both requirement number 1, which is to install and maintain a firewall configuration, and requirement number 2, which is to not use vendor-supplied defaults. And we'll take a look at these requirements in detail later. But for now, just realize that you have a set of goals which are more theoretical about the principles, and then the requirements, which are the specific manifestations of those goals. So again, while the goals are more generic, as I just mentioned, they're about the principles. The requirements are more technical and explicit, usually with specific rules and procedures to be implemented. So in this example, the goal is to build and maintain a secure network. It's generic. But for example, in requirement number 1, you will have specific procedures in terms of changes to firewall configurations, the specific documents that must be produced, including network topology and cardholder flow diagram, authorization rules that deny users the ability to change their firewall settings, and so on. So goals are generic while requirements are very explicit. In many cases, organizations even ignore the goals and they just follow the requirements themselves as a checklist. So while this is not necessarily the best approach, because you need to understand the rationale behind the requirements, it definitely can be done. The requirements can be checked like boxes. And finally, it's also important to understand some of the terms related to the PCI DSS compliance process itself. In order to comply with PCI DSS, merchants need to assess themselves. And for this, there are usually 2 major mechanisms. The first is a report on compliance, or ROC, which involves a qualified assessor visiting the company and doing a levy examination. The other option is a self-assessment questionnaire, or an SEQ, and there are 8 types that depend on how the organization deals with card data, whether it's a web portal, or it uses dial-up POS devices, or whether it's a service provider, and others. Usually, the bank of the merchant requires them to do this questionnaire themselves, and they deliver it to the bank afterwards to complete the assessment. And the biggest criterion for whether a company is forced to have an ROC or whether they can just fill an SAQ is whether they are a level 1 merchant. We'll cover this in detail later because there are 4 levels of merchants, and it's all based on the transaction volume. So level 1 merchants have more than 60 million transactions per year. This is regardless of the transaction values, it's just the volume. More than 60 million. And the rule is simple. If you are a level 1 merchant, you must take an ROC, period. Every other type of merchant can get away with filling an SEQ. But we have one more acronym before we go. The ROCs, or returns on compliance, are usually performed by a QSA, who is a qualified security assessor. So these are independent and certified security auditors that go into the organization, examine how much they comply with PCI DSS, and produce a report. And out of curiosity, the QSAs are not just useful to perform full reports on compliance. They certainly do these, but they can also help a company select the type of SEQ that they must fill. So they're specialists in both types of PCI DSS assessment. But to summarize, in terms of assessment, the company either takes an ROC or an SEQ, and it all depends on whether they are a level 1 merchant or not. If they are, they need a report on compliance with a physical visit from a QSA and a report elaborated. Otherwise, they can fill an SEQ, which can be aided by a QSA or not, and they have to select one of 8 types in total, depending on the organization that they have. And finally, there are some terms that are important to be aware of in terms of payments in general. Any payment professional will be aware of these, but some may not be familiar with the industry, so it's important to clarify these. So, in any transaction or payment between a consumer and a merchant, there are usually 2 banks involved. One of them is the issuing bank that issued the card of the cardholder or consumer, and the other is the acquiring bank, which is the bank where the merchant has an account. For example, you may hear about these in terms of fraud or dispute cases. If there's fraud on the credit card, then the issuer bank of that card performs an investigation because the card was issued by them. And in a chargeback process, it's believed that the cardholder deserves their money back. So the issuing bank performs what's called a chargeback, which is a request of the acquiring bank to give the money back. So these are 2 important terms. PCI DSS is a type of compliance in specific that is demanded of merchants by their acquiring banks. So if I have an accounting firm, for example, and I have an account at HSBC, then they will be the ones requiring that I be PCI DSS certified. And if it's a self-assessment questionnaire or SAQ, then I fill it and I deliver it to the bank. It's important to note that PCI DSS is not legal regulation, it's industry regulation. So if a merchant doesn't comply with it, the government is not going to go after them. They don't break the law, but the bank themselves may impose fees on them or fines, or even fire them as a customer, or the card company can do so as well. And finally, the handling of cardholder data by the merchant can be performed in a CP or card present environment, which is, for example, what happens if you're paying through a terminal in a shop, for example, in a Starbucks coffee shop, usually with a PIN number for authentication, or in a card non-present environment, or CNP. And this is, for example, buying online on Amazon, and it usually uses the CVV number for authorization. What are some examples of these terms? The first is choosing the right SEQ. There are 8 different types of SEQ, as we mentioned, and these depend on how the company handles cardholder data, whether they store it or not, how they transmit it, whether the card is present, not present, and so on. Then, as mentioned, PCI DSS is industrial compliance, not legal. In this case, it's not demanded by the law, but demanded by the merchant's acquiring bank. Or if you are a service provider instead of a merchant, It's usually the card company itself instead of a bank. And again, failing it is not breaking the law, but it can still have grave penalties, including fines, sanctions, payment limitations, or in a worst case scenario, actually being fired by your bank or card company. And finally, the card data environment being reduced is a practice. As we mentioned, the CDE or card data environment is what defines what needs to be PCI DSS certified. So a frequent practice is for companies to reduce the scope of the CDE as much as possible, because the less systems or networks that handle card data, the smaller the scope of compliance. If you have 26 Wi-Fi networks, having your card data go through one of them versus all 26 is brutal. It's the difference in having to comply with firewall configurations, logging configurations, intrusion detection systems, file integrity monitoring, and many other requirements which will check in one network versus 26. So organizations are always looking to reduce the CDE. What are our key takeaways here? The first is the CDE and the non-CDE, the set of systems and networks that deal with cardholder data, that is, that store it or transmit it, are the card data environment, or CDE. All other systems and networks are the non-CDE. Then, cardholder data can be split into CHD or SAD. Cardholder data is usually the information on the front of the card. It can be stored and transmitted. SAD, or sensitive authentication data, is usually the data on the back. CVV numbers, the magnetic track, PIN numbers, and it absolutely cannot be stored, just transmitted. The PCI DSS is a set of standards, have 6 goals and 12 requirements. Each goal has one or more requirements associated. While the goals are more general and they represent principles, the requirements are very declarative and technical by nature. They're things like saying you need unique IDs for users, you need change management for all firewall rule changes, you need risk assessment once a year with an output, and so on. Then, PCI DSS compliance can be achieved through a report on compliance or a self-assessment questionnaire. It all depends on whether you are a level 1 merchant or not. If you have more than 60 million transactions per year, you are level 1 and you require a report on compliance with a physical visit from a QSA. If you aren't, then you can perform a self-assessment questionnaire, which is usually one of 8 types. And finally, there are some useful terms in terms of the payment industry itself. In any transaction between a cardholder and the merchant, the bank of the merchant is known as the acquiring bank, and the bank of the cardholder is known as the issuing bank, and the card company is usually the intermediary between both. So as you see, these are the major terms that are going to come up repeatedly when we cover the PCI DSS set of requirements.